All right, we are live. I am Kristen Kerr, and I interview practitioners of ML, DL, and AI about interesting projects that they're working on. I am super excited to have Daniel Parris here with me today. He is a data science consultant and the author of Stat Significant. Previously, he worked for Doordash, and he's going to share about some of the cool projects that he worked on while there. Daniel, would you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about Stat Significant?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I had a sort of weird path to data science and tech in general. I was a film major in college, and I wanted to grow up to be like a Hollywood writer or director. So I went to school and I majored in film, and then I actually interned in the entertainment industry for a few summers. So I worked for like the Conan O'Brien show and Steve Carell, and I just hated it. It wasn't a good fit, and I think being at the lowest rung of entertainment wasn't my favorite thing in the world. And I sort of forecasted what the next 5 to 10 years were going to be, and I decided that it was a good time to maybe get out. So I moved to San Francisco, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do. So I ended up with a job in sales, and the company, I think, quickly figured out that I was not great at sales, but they thought that they might be able to repurpose me as like a data analyst. So they started paying for me to take night courses to learn SQL and Excel. And I found that I really liked it. So I actually started paying for my own courses to basically just learn at night. So I was able to learn data science, Python, machine learning, advanced statistics. And I moved to Doordash in 2016. I initially actually started out on the operations side back when the company really didn't actually have much of a centralized data science function. And then at the time that I joined, it was about 150 people. After about a year, moved to the data science side, and we'll talk about some of the projects I worked on. And I stayed for 6 years. And by the time I left, I believe the company was at 10 to 12,000 people. So it ended up being about like 25 different companies during the time that I was there. It was already growing a lot, and the pandemic happened, and that was a pretty wild time. And then I left Doordash after 6 years. I actually still consult for them, and I consult for a number of other companies. And then I started a newsletter called Stat Significant, where I write data-centric essays about pop culture topics. So movies, television, music, just to give maybe a preview or flavor of what those are. Some of my favorites include why do people hate Nickelback so much? And trying to find like a statistically defensible rationale why people hate Nickelback. And I actually found a lot more than just their music is bad. So that was actually kind of a fun one where I went through the sort of like looking glass and I came out the other side and I was a bit more enlightened, tracking the career of Nicolas Cage over time and seeing how crazy that is just statistically. And then also looking at like our best picture winners getting worse, how has music changed over time? And so I've been working on this newsletter for about, I would say, maybe 6 to 9 months, and it's grown to about almost like 4,000 subscribers. And it's awesome because I find I get to sort of combine all of these different things that I love, like the film thing and the data thing. And yeah, no plans to stop.
That's amazing. I love how you got your start by being repurposed from sales, and like you're able to sort of look back and be like, hey, this company invested in me and now I have this whole career. Like, and I think that's really unique. I don't think that there's like, typically if people don't think you're a good fit, you sometimes just, are told as such.
Yeah. That's the optimistic way to look at it. I honestly think that there's the way that I sometimes look at it is that they probably would have had to like fire me because I was so bad at sales. And so obviously maybe I showed some sort of upside with critical thinking skills, and they felt confident enough in that to invest in me. But I also think that I probably could not continue on in my sales capacity. So there was also.
Yeah, no, that's really cool though. And then, so if I sign up for your newsletter now, will I be able to read about why people hate Nickelback, or did I already miss the bus on that one?
I mean, it's a Substack newsletter, so you can go back and look at that.
Okay, perfect. That's exact. So everyone out there, if you're looking to research why people don't like Nickelback, make sure to check out Stat Significant. And so can you give us a little bit more about your journey at Doordash?
Yeah. So DoorDash was my second job out of college. Effectively, I worked at a small travel startup for a year in that sort of like sales, somewhat analytics capacity. So I didn't have enough experience to immediately get a data science role. I initially applied actually for the data science team, and they gave the take home case study, and I put together, I think like a 60 slide deck, something ridiculous now in retrospect. And I think what was determined by the analytics team was that I was still too junior to get a data science role, but that I might like, it would be good for me to be in DoorDash at some capacity. So they actually transferred me to the operations side, which honestly was a blessing, because at the time, DoorDash was an extremely decentralized company, right? There was like people in Houston running the Houston market, and people in Northern California running the Northern California market, and people, in Charlotte running Charlotte. So I ended up in the Northern California market, was one of the people who ran that. And I think what was really valuable was that I got to get in the business at like the lowest level of detail. So in a given day, you could be out selling restaurants, convincing them to be on the platform, or you could be figuring out what supply and demand was going to look like for that day, trying to forecast, okay, this is how many orders we're going to get, and then this is what we maybe have to do in order to get this many drivers on the road so that we can match supply and demand and hit certain quality thresholds. And you were, at the lowest level of details, at the lowest level, you're walking into these restaurants, having conversations with small business owners. Most of the time they would like throw you out because they didn't understand what food delivery was. Again, not very good at sales. And then I actually, they pulled data once, and I was like one of the worst at sales historically.
That's something.
I know I keep on that, but somebody once did that analysis, and they're like, yeah, you're not good. And so at the lowest level of detail, yeah, you would be talking to small business owners, and then you could also look 3,000-foot view, and you could say, okay, here's what customer retention has looked like for the past couple of weeks. We need to change the way that we do email because our engagement isn't great, or we need to change the way or reconfigure the way that the driver pay model works because we're actually seeing that drivers aren't liking the offers that we're giving. So it was really incredible. And the DoorDash data set too, so robust. If you think about it, like the sort of like feedback cycles are really quick, because every day people order food and you can actually reconfigure the system and see changes immediately the next day. So it's this wonderful playground to learn. And I learned so much about the business that after about a year, I ended up actually switching to the data science team, and I think one of my competitive advantages within the company was that I had this really strong granular experience, and I was able to match that with this data science skill set. So I can maybe touch on like my first really big project if you'd like to go that route right now.
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear about it.
Cool. So an obsession of DoorDash at that time was, I think there was an understanding that the way that the company would grow sustainably was to get the best restaurants on the platform. And I know that sounds like a given today, but it actually wasn't consensus at the time. So you had companies like Uber Eats launched, and their value proposition was like, we'll get you food fast. And there maybe wasn't as much of an emphasis on selection. Grubhub, who was a legacy player, had restaurants mostly that had their own delivery services. So this was like pizza restaurants and maybe like a mom and pop Chinese food restaurant. And DoorDash, I think the understanding was, okay, we need to get the best restaurants in every single city. And so the way that it used to work for getting restaurants on the platform was you would have people who were stationed in these markets, much like I was, who would say, okay, I think that this restaurant is good. Like ipso facto, I will walk into that restaurant and convince them to be on DoorDash. And that's great to a point. Oftentimes, as an example, in San Francisco, you have these like affluent tech employees who maybe didn't have like the greatest understanding of like what the entire Bay Area might want. And so they would often go after like the super chic salad place.
As we do.
And honestly, like the restaurants that people wanted most in San Francisco were like Popeyes, Cheesecake Factory. And so there was an understanding that there was maybe a more efficient way to do that incorporated customer preference rather than relying on an operations manager.
Developers' opinions.
The other thing too is there was an understanding that in order to scale the company, that you couldn't just continue to hire people to be in every market. Mm-hmm. So for some of the first geographies that were like these major metropolitan areas, it made sense to hire someone to be in those markets. But let's say that you wanted to launch certain suburbs, or you wanted to launch, actually cover the entire United States. It no longer was scalable to just hire a single person to be in those places. And then third, we needed to actually create like a compensation model at scale to say, okay, we're going to have 100 people on the ground selling restaurants, and then we're going to have 300 people in a call center selling restaurants. So how do we actually configure a pay model that works for everybody? So I had been obsessed with this problem at a small scale and then continued to be obsessed with it. So on the weekends, I would actually try to figure out how can we project if a restaurant is going to be successful before it's on Doordash. And so originally this was me playing around with Yelp data. I actually found that there wasn't much of a correlation with Yelp data because Yelp often favors restaurants that have been in business long enough, and then they're so biased against chains because it's like local foodies. And so those two things actually were major knocks against Yelp when it came to predicting like food delivery success. And so I kept trying to figure out like what are things that we can mine from within the DoorDash ecosystem to try to project what is actually going to do well once it's on the platform. And so there was a major breakthrough, I think, like a year or so into my time at DoorDash, which is the company launched this feature, kind of threw it out there called Request a Restaurant. And I know,
Ooh,
yeah, and I know it sounds, but they kind of threw this out there, and ultimately what I was able to find doing some of the analysis was like, okay, if X number of people request this restaurant, it will then do a certain amount like well on the platform. And then it was ultimately taking that and then maybe building in a few other features, like what are people searching on the platform, some stuff around cuisine, some stuff around what is the scale of these markets, and ultimately projecting, okay, what is like actually putting a number to what that restaurant is then going to produce when it's on the platform. And so I had sort of like the bones of this model. I was still early in my data science career, so I paired up with a really talented machine learning data scientist named Don Liu. Shout out to Don Liu. She took my like garbage code and made it something workable. And then what we were able to do as well to actually like prove that this was the way that we wanted to do things is we ran an A/B test where in the same market, we basically said, okay, the model is going to pick these restaurants to get on the site. And then humans, like we had humans pick what are the same restaurants that they would want on the platform. And then ultimately we sort of ran the two things against each other, and we saw we were able to get a lot of those restaurants on the site. And what we found was that the model was able to produce more deliveries, like the restaurants that the model selected. And so that was good enough to provide confidence to effectively switch the entire company over to this model. And then we were able to build like a compensation structure around it. So that was actually honestly the meat of it, was trying to figure out how to sort of like slice and dice and package all of these predictions into leads for the sales team, and then sort of connect this to a compensation model that they cared about. So there's a lot more, and I can talk about this for a very long time, and I'm sure we will, but I'll maybe stop there for now.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a really awesome problem. And yeah, I'd love to hear more about, if you could talk about the like algorithms, different considerations, just sort of like dive right in if you remember.
Yeah, well, I remember. I guess there's also an interesting direction which we can take this, which is things went really, really wrong at launch. And maybe we could dive into that if you want.
Yeah, no, I'd absolutely like to hear about that.
So I was still super early in my data science career, and I really did not think critically about like data quality or data engineering or a data pipeline. And this entire experience obviously reconfigured the way that I thought about those things. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, the way that the company started in building this data set, right? Because effectively there's a few different components of this problem. One is, can we make a database of every restaurant that exists in the US? And that is actually way harder than the modeling exercise. And there's like, can we collect some data on preference and get an understand, then take that data and then turn it into a workable projection? And then there's a third component, which is actually creating this data pipeline that then takes those predictions and makes it so that those can then be distributed to sales reps and have some sort of figure attached. So it turns out actually that the hardest thing, and probably still the hardest thing, is can we figure out which restaurants exist and still exist? So as you know, oh, sorry, you go.
Right, but so you have people requesting restaurants. Like, did you feel like you needed to know about every restaurant? If it's a pizza shop that no one goes to, gets very little business, on the verge of shutting down, like, did you really feel like you needed to know about everybody?
Yeah, well, so actually people couldn't request things. We didn't have it in our database, which was a huge issue. And
Yep.
then also there's like data quality problems where people might request something that they didn't even know was out of business. Sometimes people would think, oh, I guess it's like on the app, but it's out of business, which happened a lot. They'd be like, oh, my favorite pizza place closed down like 6 months ago, but it's on Doordash, so I'll like request it, which happened a lot and was unfortunate. So,
Right.
and then there was like, okay, well, what if like we accidentally, there's like a data quality problem upstream, and that means that we actually displace a record and mix it up with another one. So the best restaurant in Houston actually is something that is not even a restaurant at all. So there was just like a myriad of potential problems. And we built the data set. I think it's actually pretty difficult, as you can imagine, to cultivate that data set. And so we started off with a data set from Foursquare, and there's nothing wrong with Foursquare, but a lot of their data is like decently old from the time when people very actively used Foursquare. And we also just didn't do a ton of like upstream checks to see like, does this thing exist? Is it a restaurant? Some of the stuff that I now, in retrospect, I'm like, how did I make these mistakes?
You could create a whole data quality case study and it'd be great.
That was not my intention at the time. Yeah, it was an incredible data quality case study. So I sort of thought that, and this is, I guess, a good learning for aspiring ML folks, I just assumed that a really high quality model would win out. And to your point, like maybe these predictions, like the predictions would only work for the restaurants that were like really big. And I didn't understand that if you have like garbage upstream of everything, that it just gets like compounds and compounds and compounds and gets worse as you move downstream. So basically the first day I had gone on this victory tour saying, hey, like we were able to put together this model and it's awesome and it's going to change the way we do things. And we even ran this test and it's incredible. And the first day we distribute these leads, and the sales reps, remember, they get like 200 leads and something like that. And ultimately they get paid if they, based on this. And so imagine that like 25% of that lead list is garbage. And so their earning opportunity has now decreased by 25%. And so there was immediate feedback as soon as we distributed these things that people were seeing things that weren't restaurants. And so they actually started compiling a list of not just things that were restaurants. They actually just made a list of the worst offenders. And so this was like strip clubs, McKinsey ended up on the lead list. I don't even know how this is possible.
Oh, what if the strip club has a great buffet?
Joke that someone made to me, but I was not in the mood to hear it. And every time I've told this story, people are like, but strip clubs serve food. And my thing is like, well, should a driver have to go into the strip club and pick up the food? But there was, strip clubs, there was McKinsey, there was a DaVita dialysis center.
Oh, jeez.
And it just piled up and piled up. And I think by the end of the day, this Google sheet of just the most offensive, like the worst is like 4,000 or 5,000 things. And I sat in the room with the head of sales. Honestly, I think I just like had my head on the table, having to go through each one of these and explain like how this could have happened. And so it was good learning for many different reasons. I think one was basically understanding that the importance of like data quality. But two, I think is sort of understanding like the stakeholder management component of working in a data function with non-data stakeholders. So I then had to go on some sort of tour because now these people just didn't trust this model. And this was ultimately, how DoorDash was hoping to scale selection. And so there was a lot of work for me to help people understand where we had gone wrong, the changes that we were making in order to ensure that the quality was going to be better moving forward. There obviously was then a lot of resourcing that was needed in order to create this vast data engineering pipeline, because we had to do a lot of data quality checks, and also ensure that this pipeline worked in such a way where we could seamlessly distribute these things. It ended up, I think, being about a sort of like 2-year project to get it to the point where we could just distribute these things and we could feel extremely confident that leads were the things that we wanted them to be. And obviously, like, it was still a very big change for Doordash, but it was a lot of convincing and helping the salespeople understand that these are the best possible leads, and that just because you see, you know, a rogue strip club on your lead list, that does not mean that the entire model is garbage. Yeah.
No, that sounds like a really interesting conversation to have. And that extends to, you know, other people's data projects and business as well. It's like these things happen, and then just trying to have that conversation and trying to not lose trust while also saying, like, well, it's working exactly how it was programmed to, and we just have to put some safeguards into place to make sure that, you know, we're bumping up against a list of real restaurants or, you know, other things. But yeah. So right. So what was like the inner workings of this model? How was it actually? Like, was there an algorithm you were using that helped to assess, and do you know what the main drivers were, or?
Yeah, I think ultimately what we realized pretty quickly, so I mean, just to be super nitty gritty, I think we ultimately ended up with a tree-based model. We tested a few against one another. I think being able to take into consideration the interaction effects, right? So it's like, as an example, it's like this cuisine and it's in this market, which does this amount of volume, and it's getting this many, you know, it has this much sentiment, positive sentiment around it from consumers. Being able to have those things taken into consideration together ultimately beat out, say, a linear model where all of those things are often assessed independent of one another. So that was sort of the nitty gritty behind that. And then, yeah, ultimately from like a feature component, the major learning, and it sounds kind of very obvious, but a lot of folks thought going into, like, before the model was created, it was like, oh, the way that we should think about selection is it's just cuisine. That's right. So as an example, people in Houston need like 10 good pizza restaurants and then we're good. Our people in San Francisco need like 12 Greek restaurants and then that's enough. And so there was a lot of thought that, like, cuisine was going to be a major driver predictor of how something is going to perform. Ultimately, it really just boiled down to people want the thing, and then you somehow quantify how much they want the thing, and then that turns into a projection, and then that is ultimately like the thing that was the greatest predictor. So I think, I truly don't remember, but I remember the majority was just 2 or 3 key features, which were like basically directly mining data from the users about what they wanted. And the way you could think about that is that, you know, in San Francisco, one of the most desirable restaurants is a Greek fast casual salad place. And that place, it has this exceptional brand. And so you often just need to think about restaurants on like a one-to-one basis. Like, there is, you know, only one in Chicago, there's only one Pequod's Pizza, right? And so if you just sort of made a stock prediction for all pizza restaurants, that wouldn't be the same as thinking about like, oh, this is the restaurant. This is Portillo's, which is a great restaurant in Chicago and is very different from all other like hot dog places in Chicago. And so being to be hyper specific about like the one best brand or the one best restaurant ultimately meant that we had to collect the data at that level rather than relying on cuisine affinity at like the market level.
And then, so what did getting that data look like? Because I know you said that you didn't have access to the request feature that was added on the app, right? That data wasn't stored in the database?
It actually was. So it was stored in the database. So ultimately we would build this database of every restaurant that exists, and we would also hopefully these restaurants would still be in business, and then people could request those restaurants. And so that was a huge feature. And then I would say the other really big driver was seeing what people were typing into search and looking at searches that returned nulls. And so as a fun little case study, when I was like running San Francisco, I was looking at this data and I saw that people in San Francisco kept searching pop. And I was like, what is pop? And there was this burger place called Popson's. And so I was like, oh, it's Popson's. And so I put up this burger place and it got 0 orders. And so I was like, oh, this data is garbage. Like I guess I'm just like out of touch. And then one day I was walking down the street and I saw a Popeyes and I was like, oh. So we put up the Popeyes, or we were able to get the Popeyes on the platform, and that ended up being like one of the 5 best restaurants in San Francisco from a food delivery perspective. So it was just looking at that search data, obviously trying to mine that in a way that didn't cause downstream data quality problems, because that's also a good example of like there could be multiple restaurants with pop in it. So trying to take that search data and then connect it to a very specific restaurant in our database, and then those 2 features at a high level, and there's probably a lot more today, I think were like the bulk of what was like helpful for predictions.
All right. Yeah, no. And so I've seen too where we've before asked people like, what are you looking for? And they'll be like, we want this thing, front and center on the app. And then you put it there and you actually watch like the click tracking and no one uses it. So I thought this was going to be one of those instances of like people, but so, did you end up coming with a way to manage for the fact that people were going to not necessarily use the correct name of the restaurant, or was that stayed a manual process?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's a trade-off between, it's sort of like a precision recall trade-off, which is you probably need to see, like with every character that someone types in, you get a little bit more certain that they're searching for the thing that you think they're searching for. So there was a lot of work done to figure out, okay, at what point can we say that, as an example, so if someone just types in pop, we probably don't have enough information to say this is attached to Popeyes or Popson's. But if this person types in 8 characters, 9 characters, 10 characters, and it's like Popeyes Louisiana Kitchen, you start to get increasingly confident that they're searching for the thing that you think they're searching for. And then there's also some downstream matching process where you say, okay, this was matched to 5 possible things. That's probably not good. Or this was matched to 1 or 2 possible things. And we feel a lot more confident that this person typed in those letters, and we know that there's like a near 1-to-1 match.
Yeah. Cool. That sounds like a really awesome project. Was there anything else at Doordash that you'd like to touch on?
Yeah, I worked on a lot. I worked on a bunch of other stuff. I'm trying to think of like another good. I would say the selection one was particularly fun because like I was there from the beginning, and it was sort of built from scratch. I did a fair amount of work on like the supply and demand system at Doordash. So trying to help that get to scale. So understanding like this is how many hours we're going to need 3 weeks from now, and then working to figure out this is how many drivers we're going to need to acquire in each of these markets. And then here is how we think about mobilizing X number of people to get on the road at this time. I wasn't involved in the like creation of that. I helped a lot with the optimization of that. So we can talk about that if you want.
Yeah, sure. No, I'll hear more about that.
Sure. So ultimately, I think like the biggest thing was trying to convert, like when you think about the supply and demand system, it's extremely complex. There's a lot of moving parts. And so it's actually a huge exercise to try to convert everything into a common currency and figure what is the time frame at which we're predicting or what we need to make a projection. So ultimately what we ended up doing is sort of dividing into 2 different time frames. One was the next 7 days, or roughly like, in the short term. And it was like, what do we think the next week is going to look like, or next couple of days? And then how do we figure out like how many hours like we're going to need in Jacksonville, or how many hours we're going to need in this specific suburb of Illinois? And then there was a separate prediction that needed to be made, which was a little bit further out. So it was a few weeks out. And that was trying to predict, okay, how many hours do we think we're going to need as it relates to acquisition? Because actually, when you're thinking about short term, you could probably run incentives to try to get people on the road, but that spend is going to be extremely inefficient. And oftentimes, if you're trying to optimize day of, that you're not in a great place. Versus if you're thinking critically many weeks in advance, you're going to hopefully acquire the right number of people, and then you won't need to do those short-term optimizations. And so it was ultimately building, I think, this like two-tiered system, and then sort of getting everybody in this sort of supply and demand apparatus together to try to understand, like, okay, here are the needs across the entire company, and here's the need on a geographic basis, and here's how we're going to allocate some sort of spend to make sure we can match supply and demand X number of weeks from now in this particular place. And then there was like a separate secondary meeting after that, which was with a much smaller group to say, oh, here is what's going on in like Austin this week, and we need to be very weary of supply and demand. Oh, there's going to be a rainstorm, and how are we going to confront that?
Mm-hmm.
That's like the high level of the project. And it was
Did demand go way up when it rains?
Yeah, demand. So basically when it rains, it's kind of like the worst possible thing for the supply and demand system, because more people order and fewer people want to go on the road.
Yeah.
So that's a really tough one. Another one, and this is, I think I have some scars from these experiences, which was a Valentine's Day is far and away one of the most ridiculous days for matching supply and demand. This is always, I guess, the face you're making is kind of everyone's response. They're like, what?
No, that makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. A lot of people like to stay in and order, and a lot of people who are staying in and ordering would prefer not to go on the road and deliver food.
Yeah, they want to watch a movie.
And it was really shocking. I remember when we were running the sort of like Northern California market, and this was early Doordash days, where this was like the first time that this happened to us, because the company had just reached like some meaningful scale. We just had no idea what was happening. And we looked at the supply and demand figures and we were like, oh God. And it was literally like, the perfect storm, if you remember that movie, where there's this giant wave and there's like a tiny little boat. It's effectively that. And so there were these funny days where you just like, if you think about human psychology at like the most granular level, completely makes sense that would happen. But we experienced a lot of those in real time, and it was just funny to watch those happen.
No, I've had those experiences too, where we'd dummy out things like Daylight Savings Day or just any of the holidays. And yeah, things could get really weird. One thing that really tripped me up when I was modeling gas was that in 2010, the price of oil went way up. And so people started converting to gas. So all of a sudden my model is off, but it's because we're doing way better than my model predicted. And it took me months to even figure out like, what was this change that had happened that is making us do so well? And it was because people were investing the money to change from oil to gas. But yeah, no, I get really excited about this stuff.
And I would actually say there is like maybe a learning to draw from all of this. Oh, look at that question. I can address that in a second. But I would say a big learning was, and one thing that Doordash did really well is, I don't think as much as a pure data scientist, I would love everything to run fully automated. The business was complex to a point where like day by day, it's hard to just put things in autopilot. Weather is a great example. When it rains, demand spikes, supply shrinks. You can model that, but sometimes it's just really difficult to get it like exactly. And so it was really important to keep operators involved and to have that like local knowledge. And I would say one of the ways that the company like succeeded and won, quote unquote, is that there is, I think, still today that like local involvement, and having that local involvement was really important because sure, I would love to believe that we built a model that like perfectly projected what was going on in the city. But let's say that a new location is opening up of a really beloved chain. That's not going to be in the model. And that's, you're going to need someone on the ground who has that information, who is going to supplement some of the flaws in the model. And so that was something, at first I thought it was a loss if you embraced the human component of the business. I thought, surely I must, I mean, my first like 2 years of data science on data science, I think I just like acted under complete and total hubris. But I learned over time that it was actually really important to work with people on the ground and to supplement the gaps in the model. And it was also better too, because then it didn't create like an adversarial relationship. It created a relationship where both were able to work together, and you were able to use one to supplement the other's knowledge.
Yeah, no, and plus too, like not having all your data sources connected or the data that you need is more the like example of the real world than what, you know, a lot of times we're, you know, talking about how much easier it's becoming to connect data and all these things, but like for the majority of businesses, like that's still a big issue. You know, even though we have the capabilities to do these things now, there's still like lots of models that don't make it into production just because the data sources aren't actually talking to each other.
Yeah.
Are we ready to answer that question now?
Yeah. Okay. This is a longer question, so I'm going to take a second to read it. What is the most important reason for that here? Yeah, I mean, well, I would say one thing, just whenever you're rolling out a model in advance, humility, very important. I think it's really difficult to build a career on being perfect all the time, especially when it comes to forecasting. So I would say I shot myself in the foot even before we launched the model by taking this, what I felt was like a victory lap, and sort of showing that this was the way that we were going to do things and that there was going to be no issue. You can think about it too, like I could have referred to it as a pilot. I could have referred to it as a beta. I could have been very clear about rolling it out market by market and having a test case. So a lot of that, I think you actually have to do in advance with the way that you sort of structure and sort of like market this data product to other people within the company. Because I think it's actually pretty difficult after the fact to then go and say, oh, this was like inevitable. Sorry. If you told people that this was going to be the savior for the company and this is going to be the thing that up-leveled everything. I think ultimately what I had to do was take that humility and then like bring it. I had to come after the fact, like ex post facto, but with a sense of humility. So to admit that there was a mistake, admit that these were the issues, admit that these issues are probably going to be problematic for the next X number of time, and then just be very good at communicating with the folks that were affected by this thing. I doubt that I was able to recapture everybody's confidence. Maybe had I, like if I had done it in advance, you know, maybe I would have had 100% confidence. Having to do it after the fact probably was at like 60 or 70% confidence. So I think it's very much like a problem of my own design. And I now have learned after the fact that I should have done more before the fact.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's such a good learning. What are you working on now?
Yeah, so at Doordash right now, I'm contracting. So that takes the form of, so I'm in a very funny place, which is that I have very strong understanding of the database because, you know, throughout my time, I worked on all of these random problems. I can effectively just like slot in and work on something without much explanation. So I sort of think of myself as kind of like this roving like band where there's like a new problem, and I typically work now on the driver's side, and they'll just be like, oh, we need to optimize this specific thing, and it's an issue that just came up. So they'll say, you know, go work on this, and I'll say, okay, and I can just go and work on that without much explanation or hand holding. So that's at least in my current capacity for Doordash. I would say separately, well, another thing too, for any folks listening, I'm taking up new consulting clients. So if you're looking for data science consulting, let me know. I'd plug that. But Another thing, there's actually been like a decent amount of business stemming from the Stat Significant newsletter.
Oh, nice.
People, I guess I've now found like a very specific niche, which is pop culture, especially movies and television, and being able to take data and put it behind that. And so a lot of the articles have actually been adapted either into YouTube videos or co-syndicated by other publications. And then there's been a lot of interest in writing research content. So folks in the entertainment industry will say, hey, we want to put out content either using data that we have or just research data that's out there to draw people into some sort of sales or business development deal that's going on. And so I've gotten commissioned to effectively write things for a company to serve as like top of funnel, but this is like above average, like well-researched content.
Mhm.
And so that's actually been a really fun like course of study. And it's really funny to think, I assumed when I moved into data science that was sort of the end of my professional association with film and television. And it's weird to come full circle and combine things. And sometimes when I tell people, they're like, weird. I didn't know that need existed. Yeah.
Mhm. No, I mean, that's my experience too. I'm making a lot more content now than I ever thought I was going to make, for sure. We do have one more question.
Wow. Okay. Good question. I am not going to have a good answer to this.
Mhm.
So one of my like current weaknesses that I wouldn't say weakness is not the right word. And this actually shoehorns into like a third thing that I'm working on is that I worked, at a company that like towards the end of my time that I was there, it kind of became a corporation. And so the way that I was taught to do things was like a specific way. And my understanding of like the full data field has at one point like calcified, right? It was like I knew how to use these specific set of tools because I was taught to use them at this company that I worked at for a very long time. So I guess a few things that you can do. So me personally, I actually started a new newsletter where I'll talk with data professionals and transcribe and abridge the conversations. And I did that one to help people learn, but I did that too because I wanted to keep learning. I sort of had this acknowledgement that I had been at one place one time. I had not been actively researching what was going on in the data field. And then one day something called Databricks just appeared and that was like a new paradigm. So as an example of like something new that just like popped up. So obviously not everyone's going to do that. But that's like my personal response to trying to keep upskilling. I would say there's an incredible explosion of like content from content creators who are in the data science field. Obviously, what we're doing right now is a good example of how to stay apprised of what's going on. Kenji, who's a friend, puts out a lot of really great content. Seattle Data Guy is a Substack that I follow. I think, between podcasts and between newsletters, there's a lot of really incredible free content out there. There's the Super Data Science podcast is another one that I follow, or This Week in AI, if you want to just like keep up with AI. There's also 18 million AI newsletters if you want to just follow any one of those. So I've come around slowly. I think there was a while where my learning kind of lapsed. And then within the last year, I had this acknowledgement, especially as a consultant, that I needed to be on top of every new data trend because you need to be pliable if you move into a new situation. So I would say absorbing as much free content as possible helps you understand what you need to know. And then obviously after that, if you want to learn a specific thing, YouTube is probably the best possible starting point. People are putting out free content all the time on YouTube where you can continue to learn.
Oh my God, there's such amazing content on YouTube. And I completely agree with you. Like, I just staying active on LinkedIn, Reddit, a couple places where I happen to be following people who are creating content in my area. I've learned things that, there are techniques that I learned in school, like stepwise regression or whatever, that, we've decided we don't use anymore. And I wouldn't know that. I'd still be applying that had I not just be like, passively getting this information on LinkedIn. So there's just so much information out there that's free, and it is incredible. Thank you so much for the question. So wrapping it up, because we're getting to that time, if somebody wanted to find and follow you, where might that be? Where's the best place?
Yeah, well, for starters, LinkedIn. I assume, given if you're watching this, then you will very easily be able to find my LinkedIn profile. So I will accept any connection requests that come my way. And if you shoot me a message, I will respond. If you're interested in following Stat Significant, I believe the link is posted, but it's like www.statsignificant.com if you're interested in following that. And then if you want to shoot me an email, daniel@statsignificant.com. Reach out. I'm happy to chat with folks. Also, if you've got a cool data project and you want someone to work on it, reach out as well. I'm happy to talk to you. I'm excited to see who inbounds from this. It's fun talking about all of my mistakes.
Oh, that's awesome. No, I mean, and these are, I don't know, these were some really cool projects, and I had a lot of fun listening to them, and it made me think a lot about my own experience as well. But so thank you so much for joining us. Do you have any last messages before we hop off?
Yeah, I would say for people who are new to data science, I think it's a certainty that you will make mistakes. If there's any sort of theme that or through line I can draw through this, it's more about how you position those mistakes before, if you're launching something new or how it's working, and how you bounce back from those mistakes and how you communicate with people around you about those mistakes. That defines success, not being perfect with a new model. There was I think I was under the impression that to be successful in the data science field was to create the single most accurate model and to, wow everybody with my data science brilliance. I don't think that's success, nor is that a model for you to succeed long term, because you will inevitably be wrong. Error is quite literally built into data science, into machine learning modeling. And so being very good about how you work cross-functionally with people, how you set expectations, how you slowly roll something out, how you communicate what success is, how you caveat how this can be used. I think that's ultimately what spells success, not being some prediction genius.
No, 100%. And then, after you've been doing it for a bunch of years too, and you know how to do these things, you don't have to stress anymore about some of the things that would catch you off guard before, like you were saying, when they came to you and, your model was garbage. It would have just been set up differently. You would have said, hey, in this scenario, this happens, people would have known. And, and it just, there's ways that it gets easier.
Yes. Or just don't make it hard on yourself. It's kind of the other.
Right. Yeah, depends on the perspective. All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you soon with another episode.